Welcome to this year's budget tour. Now, it'd take too long to go over all the numbers, but in this video we'll do two things. First, we hope to cover what you'll need to know to understand the budget, and second, we'll review some of the specific items we think you'll be most interested in. As we mentioned last year, budgets can be hard to interpret, and city budgets in particular are kind of an odd duck. So we got some help from Councilman Dave Pratt, the liaison to our Finance Committee, and from Chris Helvey, our Finance Director. We'll be sharing with you what we learned from them. Okay, so the city's main operational budget is on these first 4 pages. For the video, we'll squish the columns together to make things a little easier to read. Notice first that our fiscal year goes from July 1st to June 30th. But even though half of the budget year is in 2022, we still call this the 2023 budget. Now let's look at these columns on the right. This first one shows how much we ended up spending in 2022, or how much we estimate we'll spend, because some of the 2022 bills still haven't come in yet. That's one reason why the amounts here could differ from this column, which shows what was budgeted. Next, we'll see how much we've spent for the 2023 budget so far. That's all zeros because this report was actually printed before the start of the fiscal year. Finally, this last column shows what we've budgeted for 2023. Everything on these pages is divided into 2 parts. The first part's revenue, all the money we expect to come in. About $1.75 million total. The second part is expenditures, all the money budgeted to go out. Again, about $1.75 million. And at the end, we have the change in net position. That's the difference between how much comes in and how much goes out. That should be 0 because state law requires a balanced budget. So why does it show that we're $500 in the hole? Oops. Chris tells me that was a computing error that's already been fixed. We'll see a couple of these as we go along, and that's one reason why this budget is temporary. It isn't absolutely finalized. The other reason is that we'll have a Truth in Taxation hearing in August, and it's after that that the City Council votes to adopt the final budget. Okay, now let's look at some of this year's numbers. First, revenue. How much money do we expect to take in? These are all the city's different money sources, things like license and permit fees, charges for services the city provides. Intergovernmental revenue is money we get from the county and the state, and of course we have property taxes. Notice that to balance our budget, the mayor's asking for a tax increase of about $67,000 over 2022. Why? Well, inflation is causing some of that, especially construction inflation for city improvements and maintenance. That inflation's running up to 4 times what you and I see at the grocery store. And we'll see some other reasons for the tax increase when we go through our expenditures, but here's something to put that increase in perspective. These are some of last year's numbers. Notice we budgeted a tax increase of about $34,000, but to balance the budget, we projected we'd also have to drain over $277,000 from our city savings account. Ouch. That was shown here under appropriation of fund balance. But look, this year's numbers show what actually happened. With additional property taxes from new homes and some responsible fiscal management, that savings withdrawal actually drops to just $65,000. It's shown here at the end of our expenditures under transfers. And what's even better, this isn't really a withdrawal at all. It's just money we're transferring into other city savings accounts, earmarking those funds for future needs. We'll talk about specifics when we get to that part of the budget, but the bottom line is that we've cut our savings account drain basically down to 0, and that's a phenomenal benefit for all of us. Okay, back up to revenue. One final thing you might notice here is this $55,000 we'll get from property taxes prior year. What's that? Well, the state actually allows people to be 3.5 years behind on their taxes before taking any action against them. So this money is from late taxes we expect to collect in 2023. Okay, now let's move to expenditures. Under administrative salaries and wages, we're budgeting $95,000 less than last year, even though we hired 1 more office staff. How does that work? Well, a couple of things. First, for a while there, to get everything done, our office people were working overtime and getting paid time and a half. Now with 1 more employee, we eliminate overtime and get more hours of work done for less money. Second, we've begun to bill some of our office work under other budgets. For example, let's skip ahead to our water budget for a second. For 2022, we budgeted $85,000 for salaries and wages, but for 2023, it's up to $120,000. Why? That increase is to cover our office staff processing water bills and things like that. So to pay for that, we've moved some of the expense that used to be in administrative over here to water.
Back to administrative.
This line's for attorney's fees, and our budget here is up to $150,000. This is one of our biggest expenses, and it's based on the monthly numbers that have been trending since the beginning of the year. Although the city uses legal services for several things, most of this expense is from legal action connected to the ongoing neighbor dispute we talked about last year. A further complication here is that the city's insurance companies told us they'll no longer cover any of the costs from this case. We've submitted an appeal, but right now it looks like we'll be paying out of pocket for this from here on out. So like last year, this represents one of our biggest budget items. That same legal action is driving most of the expense on this line too, administrative professional services. The city uses several of these services, but the biggest expenses come from outside engineers advising the city on technical aspects of the neighbor dispute case. Down here in the building section, we have a new $40,000 expense called SWPPP. That means Stormwater Pollution Prevention Plan. For years, Woodland Hills was small enough we didn't worry about this, but we're bigger now, so the state makes us hire an inspector to guard against harmful runoff from building sites in the city. That's a lot of money, but it's not really an expense. Here's why. If we look at our revenue under SWPPP, we also have $40,000 coming in from contractors who actually pay for this service. That's what we call a pass-through. One amount coming in and the same amount going out again. Our budget actually has several of those. We also have some of our city employee salary and wages in the building section, along with Social Security, retirement, and health insurance. You'll see similar entries under public safety, fire, emergency medical services, roads, snow plowing, and parks. That's because our city employees do work in all these areas, so they have parts of their salaries paid out of several of these different budgets. Under fire equipment, we're budgeting $45,000, even though we only spent about $28,000 for 2022. Actually, our fire chief submits a detailed budget of his own every year for that full amount. This is one of those situations where some of the bills may not have come in yet. Also, the chief applies for lots of grants, and those may have offset some of these costs. Also in this section, we have money from a very kind resident who donated $1,800 for our 2023 firefighter appreciation event. And you'll notice a new $2,000 expense here for emergency management. That's because a new state law requires us to have an emergency manager that attends 2 conferences a year, and this money covers food, lodging, and registration. Councilman Carrie Malkovich has volunteered for this, and she's covering her own time, gas, and mileage, which is extremely generous. Roads is another of our big increases, so let's look at that. Fortunately, many of our roads got redone with our water system upgrade, but our research has shown that just to properly maintain the remaining roads, our Public Works Director will need about $278,000 in general maintenance funds. That really would have cranked up our taxes, so we're combining budget items to try and meet that need. Only $86,000 from general maintenance instead of $278,000. And about $100,000 from Class C road funds. These come from state gasoline taxes. That gets us about 2/3 of the full amount to work with, and it keeps our tax increase more reasonable. Snow plowing equipment could use an explanation. We have 2 new snowplow trucks, and the payment on them in 2023 will be about $54,000. But because we use our trucks for snow plowing, roads, and water, we split that payment among all those budgets. So here's $18,000 under snowplow capital equipment, then under roads capital equipment, and finally under water capital equipment. By the way, we budgeted more for snowplow equipment last year because we also invested in a salt stacker, which should save us money over the next several years. This last section contains that $65,000 in transfers we talked about earlier. Here's where we try to set aside money for future expenses involving parks, roads, snow plowing, emergency medical services, and eventually a new fire truck. And at the end of the budget, we find a separate page for each of these areas showing each of the transfers. But what are all these numbers listed on the roads page? Well, these are actually 2022 road monies that we'd hoped to spend by June 30th. But because we're a small town, sometimes road contractors put us off till the end of the construction season. So this item allows us to roll that money over to the 2023 budget and spend it when the workers become available. Oh, and we also have a page for the mitigation project, even though we show all zeros for 2023, because that was all wrapped up in 2022. That leaves just two more pages, one for water and one for sewer. Those are similar because they're self-sustaining. We don't use property taxes to fund them. Sewer is the simpler of the two. It's one of those pass-throughs. We gather the payments and pass them all along to Payson City, who provides our sewer service. Actually, the numbers on this page don't quite add up. That's another of those computing errors, and it should be fixed in the final budget. Like sewer, water has its own self-contained budget. But here's something significant to notice. We build into this budget what's called a depreciation expense. That's money we set aside each year to save toward the cost of replacing our water system when it wears out. And even setting aside those funds, water is still projected to be over $38,000 in the black by the end of the budget year. It's good to have that surplus because over the past few years, waterline failures and the need for repairs have been hard to predict. So those are some things we hope will be helpful in making sense of our 2023 budget. As you look it over on your own, you might have other questions, and if you do, any of our City Council members would be happy to answer them. Just give them a call or send an email.